So right now I have the Tamron 70-300mm lens for the Nikon Z system, and this lens kind of piqued my interest a bit as a potential lightweight alternative to my Nikon 100-400mm lens, which is kind of a big and heavy lens. And I figured a lens like this may be good for hiking, backpacking, and just times when you want to take a smaller and lighter kit with you and still have a decent reach at 300mm. So I've just been out here this evening. I've been taking a bunch of shots over there of that peak, and yeah, I will show you guys some images. We'll jump into Lightroom and compare some images and see how this lens performs. So before we get into the shots here from the mountain, I just want to show you how this lens performed when I shot a test chart at different focal lengths and apertures. And we'll start off right away with some bad news about this lens, but don't worry, there is some good news to come later in the video. And so the first bit of bad news here is that at 70mm, this lens just does not really perform all that well. And I'll show you what I mean here. So these are all 70mm shots, and they're just at different apertures. So I'm going to compare f4.5 and f5.6 here, and we'll just kind of zoom in at the center of the frame. Let me move that there. So here at the center of the frame, you can see it actually looks really good. So it's really sharp, looks pretty good. But as you kind of move away towards the edges of the frame, it starts to fall apart really fast, and it just starts looking really bad, really soft. And if you look in the corners, I mean, it just looks pretty bad up here. It does not look good at all. And so you kind of see the same thing as you progress at different apertures. So if I look at f8, for example, we'll just pull up f8 here. So the center of the frame looks amazing, and this is actually where this lens performs the best in the center, is at f8. And it looks really, really good in the center. I mean, it's super sharp, but then as you move away from the center towards the edges, it just falls apart. It starts getting really soft. You can't even read. These are numbers right here that you can't even read. And so it just does not look all that great. The center looks fantastic, but as you move away, it just does not look good at all. And what I noticed as I went through different apertures here, it does start to sharpen up a bit. So now we're at f11. I'm just kind of looking at the edges. It starts to look a little bit better. And we'll compare f16 and f22. And you can see it starts to look a little bit better. Let me zoom out. So you can see over here on the left, we got f16, then here's f22. So it starts to sharpen up, but the problem is we're getting a ton of diffraction in the center of the frame when you get to these apertures. So although the edges start to kind of clean up a bit, the center just starts looking soft and not so great. And so I just wouldn't ever really want to use this lens at 70mm. I mean, unless my subject was, in the center of the frame and I didn't care about the edges of the frame at all. But typically as a landscape photographer, I do care about the edges. So let's go ahead and move into a different focal length. So we'll look at 100mm here. And I'm not going to go through each and every one of these photos, but I'll look at where the sweet spot is for the center sharpness, which again was around f8 here. So this is 100mm now, actually 102. I didn't get it quite at 100, but close enough. And again, the center looks amazing. It looks so sharp. It looks really nice. But then as you move out, it starts to get really soft, and it just does not look great. Look at all the corners here. It just does not look good at all. So this is at 100mm, and then we kind of get the same story here. As you step down, it's like f22, for example, it starts to look a little bit better down here. Like, this doesn't look that bad. It's a little bit soft, but we get diffraction again, and everything else gets soft in the center. And so, for example, if we compare like f8, where this lens sweet spot is, versus, let's say, f25 here, So we're going to notice a big difference at the corners here. So you can notice a lot more detail over here. But then if we look at the center, this is nice and sharp at f8, but then this gets really soft. So 100 millimeters, some more bad news about this lens. I wouldn't really want to use this lens at 100 millimeters either. And the same thing happens at 135 millimeters. It starts to get a little bit better as you move up in the focal range, but it's still kind of the same story. So this is f8, nice and sharp in the center, but then we go outside to the edges, and it just starts to get, it just doesn't look that great. Same thing over here. And then I'll just I'll compare f8 with f29 in this case. And let's look at the corners. So again, the corners kind of clean up here as you stop way down, but then we got a lot of diffraction, so it gets nice and, not nice and soft, but it gets soft in the center there. And so 135 millimeters, it's not really a focal length that I would go to on this lens either. But the thing is, as we move to 200 millimeters, it starts to look quite a bit better, which is good news, because really with this lens, I would want to use it at the longer focal lengths at 200 and 300 millimeters. So let's go ahead, we'll look at f8 here. So this is 200 millimeters, 198, but close enough. Nice and sharp in the center. And as we move out, it looks a lot better. I mean, it's still we're getting a little bit soft here, but the corners look a lot better. Let's go back here and also look at f11 here. So if we look at f11, still nice and sharp in the center. And as we move out, it doesn't look that bad. It looks pretty good, actually. It looks pretty dang good, actually. So 200 millimeters, yes, I would totally shoot this lens at 200 millimeters. And then the good thing is at 300 millimeters, we have a similar result where, so right now I'm at f8, 300 millimeters. The center, nice and sharp. As we move out, it stays pretty dang sharp. It actually looks pretty good here at f8. I think it's pretty sharp throughout the whole frame here, actually. So at 300 millimeters, this lens is totally usable. So basically at 200 and 300 millimeters. So that's the good news here. At 200 millimeters and 300 millimeters with this lens, we have a solid performer. It's just anything below that, it's just not very good. Well, maybe I shouldn't say anything below that, because there is kind of a gap here between 135 and 200 millimeters. So I don't know at which point the image quality starts to clean up. Is it 150 millimeters, 180, 190? I really don't know. But what I do know from my tests is that at 200 millimeters and 300 millimeters, this lens looks pretty dang good. So let's go ahead now and jump into these mountain shots here. Now I did add a little bit, I'm just going to remove this. So I did add just a little bit of dehaze here to these images because there's been a little bit of smoke, wildfire smoke in the mountains here, and it's a little bit of hazy. So I just wanted to cut through some of that just so we can get a better idea of how this lens performs. But I didn't make any other adjustments besides just adding a little bit of dehaze there. So right here we are at 70 millimeters at f8. And if I zoom in here, we'll go to the center, and it looks nice and crisp here at the center, nice and sharp. It's a whole lot of detail here. And then as we kind of move towards the edges of the frame, it softens up quite a bit. But to my eye, the amount that it gets soft is not as bad as it looked when we were looking at that test chart. So if we go over here, back to the test chart here, let's look at the same aperture, f8. So again, nice and sharp in the center here, but then you see how soft and blurry, and you can't even make this out. It gets really, really bad. But then we go back here and we look at the mountain shot here, f8, 70 millimeters, and we look at the edges. It's not nearly as noticeable. It's not nearly as soft. So, I mean, it is definitely quite a bit softer than the center, but it looks better than that test chart. So, I'm kind of wondering if this has something to do with the distance the subject is from the lens at this focal length, because this mountain is, quite a bit further than that test chart was. I mean, that test chart was maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 feet or something, whereas this mountain is quite a bit further. And so that's pretty interesting to me. Maybe I need to do some more tests with this lens. But it does look better in a real world situation when the subject is further away. And so let's go ahead now. We'll look at, I'm not going to look at all the apertures here. We'll just kind of look at f8 at some different focal lengths. And so this is 102 millimeters. So we'll zoom in here to the center. Again, it looks nice and sharp at the center. And then as we kind of move to the edges, it gets quite a bit softer again, but it's still like okay. I mean, it's definitely quite a bit softer, like I said, but it's not terrible. Like, it doesn't, like that test chart when we looked at the edges, like that looked terrible to me. But it doesn't look great, but it doesn't look terrible. So let's go ahead now. We'll move to 135 millimeters. This is f8 again. We'll zoom into center. And no surprise, it's nice and sharp here at the center. Got lots of detail around here. And let's go ahead and look at the edges. Still a decent amount of detail out here. It's definitely softer than the center was, but it's all right. Like, it's not terrible like that test chart. And so let's go ahead and we'll move to 200 millimeters at f8. Actually 198 millimeters, but close enough here. So zoom into the center, and nice and sharp. Everything's looking really good here around the center. And then as we move out, it's still looking good. So this lens to me is totally usable at 200 millimeters. And then let's look at 300 at f8. And we'll zoom in here. And kind of the same thing. Looks good in the center. Continues to look pretty good out toward the edges, but it is softer. It's noticeably softer at the edges. But overall, it's a nice image as far as the sharpness is concerned. Now, again, I was shooting through some wildfire smoke here, and a little bit of atmosphere as well. So maybe I should do some more test shots at some point to get a final verdict on this lens. But from what I've tested here, from what I've seen, at 70 millimeters, 100 millimeters, 135 millimeters, it's not the best performer, especially at least when the subject is closer to the camera. When the subject is further away, it looks better. It's still not great, but it looks better than when the subject's closer. And then when we look at 200 millimeters and 300 millimeters, the lens performs pretty solidly. It looks pretty good. Like, I would definitely use this lens at those longer focal lengths. So overall, I have some mixed feelings about this lens due to its inconsistent performance when shooting a close subject versus a further away subject. At least that's what I found from my tests here. And so a question that I have is, like, how far away does a subject need to be before the lens starts looking better at those shorter focal lengths? And to be honest, that's not really something that I want to think about when I'm out shooting for real. I mean, I'd rather use a lens that has consistent, solid performance no matter where the subject is. I want to be able to trust my gear, and I'm just not totally sure that I can trust this lens at those shorter focal lengths. like 70 millimeters, 100 millimeters, 135 millimeters. But maybe you're not as much of a pixel peeper as I am, and that edge softness at those shorter focal lengths, maybe that wouldn't be as much of a big deal to you. And on the plus side, this lens is fairly lightweight for a telephoto lens, which is great for hiking and travel. And this lens does seem to perform quite well at those longer focal lengths, which is really great news for anyone wanting 200 millimeters and 300 millimeters worth of reach on the Nikon Z system. And it's at a relatively affordable price. If this lens does seem right for you and you're thinking about picking it up and you want something at 200 millimeters or 300 millimeters, it's definitely a solid lens at those focal lengths. And I would greatly appreciate, if you're thinking about picking this lens up, if you could purchase it through my link in the description of this video. I would get a small percentage of the sale, which helps support my channel and helps me bring more quality content to you. So thank you very much for using my link. And if you're into landscape and nature photography, consider subscribing to my channel and go ahead and check out some of my videos that I have. And I'll see you on the next video.